project and editorial coordinator for Cita Press. We are here to talk about The Old Maid by Edith Wharton with Krithika Varagur, who wrote the introduction for Cita's new edition. Before we start, I'm going to just briefly introduce Cita Press, Krithika, and the book. I know some people have read it, some people might be joining without having read it. I think in both cases, we're going to be talking about Edith Wharton in general. We're going to be talking about the characters in this book and a lot of themes from Krithika's introduction, also maybe some new things. So feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts, ask questions. We'll also open it up for questions at the end, but feel free to pepper them in throughout. I'm going to use the chat to paste some links to things I'm going to talk about in a minute, and then maybe other things we talk about. I'll also email around the links that we mentioned today to the email address that you registered with, in case anyone wants to follow threads that we tug at today, if you're interested. So Cita Press is a bilingual feminist press that publishes books in English and Spanish that are free. They're either published under an open license or they're in the public domain, so people can share them, people can use them as inspiration for new works, and so on. We were founded in 2018 by designer Juliana Castro, who is here with us today. Hi, Juli. She's also our art director, and design is a big part of what we do as well. And through our library of books, we honor the principles of decentralization, collective artistic production, and equitable access to knowledge. This is our second book under a 2-year capacity building grant project called Cita Press Getting Fit, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation and supported by our fiscal sponsor, Educopia Institute. I'd like to briefly thank our advisory board, Yannicka Adema, Vicky Chaco, Catherine Mayer, Jessica Meyerson, and Mindy Sue, and our Educopia consulting team, which is Jessica Meyerson, Lauren DePena-Fraze, Catherine Kim, and Brandon Locke. We definitely couldn't do things the way we are doing them without their wisdom and support and guidance. So big thanks, and big thanks to the Mellon Foundation and Educopia in general. Our first book under this project, if you want to check it out, is we have many other books from when it was a volunteer-only project, but our first grant-funded book is St. Theresa's Meditations on the Song of Songs in Spanish and English, which is a really wild, weird, sensual text written by a 16th century nun. So check that out if you're interested. This edition, I mentioned that design is a big part of what we do. The covers are a huge part of that. The covers are a way to visually connect the text to the contemporary reader. A lot of our texts are older, they're in the public domain. The covers allow us to invite the reader into this, artifact from the past and see its significance and its themes visually. The forewords do a lot of that work with words as well. So the cover for this edition was designed by Petra Zahner, who is an East-West German graphic artist based in Paris. She's the founder and creative director of the Paris Collage Collective, which is a really cool project that embodies a lot of similar ethos to Cita, and it's international, even though it's based in Paris. It's one of the links I'll be sharing. And I think her cover does a really amazing job of showing the layers of this story and the tension between the characters. So we're really lucky to have her work as part of this edition. We're also very lucky to have Krithika's work. I'm gonna just tell you about her extremely amazing body of work briefly, but there's a lot more to it as well. So I'll put her website in the chat. If you haven't read her introduction to this edition yet, it's also excerpted at LitHub. Both versions are great. They're a great introduction to this text, to Wharton in general. So I'll be sharing those links as well. Krithika Varagur is an award-winning American journalist, author, essayist, and humorist. She's worked as a foreign correspondent in Indonesia, where she covered religion, politics, and human rights. She's also covered racial justice and policing and other topics in the US. Her work has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, NPR, the Atlantic, the list goes on. And she's currently a senior speechwriter at Fenway Strategies, which is a communications firm founded by former speechwriters of President Barack Obama. She's also the associate editor and a contributor to The Drift, which is a really cool online magazine. If you're here and you're interested in literature, you'll definitely find something there. It's really new, exciting writing on art, literature, politics, culture. Another link I'll share in a minute. And her first book is called The Call: Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project. And she's currently working on a new book called The Singh Princesses, which is about the history of 3 Punjabi princesses who played significant roles in British and Indian life from the late 19th century to the early or mid 20th century. They were suffragettes, vocal advocates for Indian independence, and allies to Jewish people fleeing Nazi Germany. I can't wait to read it. Most importantly, for our purposes today, Krithika is a huge Edith Wharton fan. She's a vocal Edith Wharton fan, and she lent her considerable talents and enthusiasm to this introduction for us. And I'm really excited to talk to her more about the book. And I'm very glad that you're all joining us for it from so many different places and time zones and so on. So just put everything in the chat that I promised. And again, I'll email this around. And Krithika, just to get us going, can you tell us about your history with Wharton as a reader and how that's evolved as you've moved through your career in other ways, and how that influenced your approach to this book in particular?
Yeah, and thank you so much for that great introduction, Jessi, and for editing my intro. It was so great to work with you and Cita. I came to Wharton just as a voracious reader when I grew up in New Jersey, so New York wasn't that far away, and I definitely came to her New York novels first. I think The Age of Innocence was probably the first Edith Wharton book that I read until I was, like many high schoolers, assigned to read Ethan Frome, which I continue to think is not a great choice. And I would like to ban it from school curriculums. I really think it turns people off reading her at an early age, and I don't think it's her best work. And I studied English in college and was mostly a Victorianist, but that is contemporaneous with the Gilded Age in New York. So I certainly read a lot of Wharton then as well. And I really, at the time, loved The House of Mirth. But it is, interesting which of her books are more interesting to you at different times. And she really is a writer for all seasons, both from being a young girl and woman to being an old maid or a grandmother and everything in between. So I expect there'll be many more books even for me to discover in the future. And then I lived abroad for several years, and I didn't really read much at all during that time. To be honest, it was hard to find books a lot of places where I was. But I returned to Wharton again during the pandemic, and after I moved to New York in the fall of 2020. She is the great novelist of New York, and also as fall turned into the spring and to the summer, she's also the great social novelist that it felt really, appropriate to read at a time when a lot of us were re-entering society. So I think she has a really deft hand with all kinds of situations. And during the pandemic, I came to love The Custom of the Country, sort of an underappreciated Wharton novel, though at the time it was one of her biggest hits. And I've since, expanded into, she really was an incredibly prolific writer. So there's so much out there, from The Decoration of Houses, which I mistakenly consulted trying to decorate my own apartment. I wouldn't recommend anyone do that because it's exclusively illustrated with photos of like Versailles and Italian palazzos. It's not really practical. but I reviewed her ghost stories, which are really great. She did a surprising amount of genre writing and magazine writing in between writing her well-known novels. And yeah, she has some incredible short stories besides, like Roman Fever, which I would recommend to anyone who likes The Old Maid. So, and I really feel still like I've only scratched the tip of the iceberg. So, and now I'm rereading The House of Mirth again because I'm writing a book, as you mentioned, about the tragic fall, you might say, of three debutantes. The same princes were debutantes at Buckingham Palace, but like Lily Bart in The House of Mirth, they didn't have a mother to secure their social position after their debut. And for some time, they did experience a precipitous drop, though none died of a possibly accidental overdose like Lily Bart did. But I found myself again and again returning to these masterpieces for the incredibly tight construction and how much they convey in just a few details. I think there's no limit to what you can get from rereadings of these. So I'm coming back to Wharton now as a student.
Yeah, and this book, so The Old Maid, for people who haven't read it, follows cousins Delia Ralston, formerly Lovell, and Charlotte Lovell, who, in my reading, they're cousins. They're not really friends at the start of it, but they occupy the same social stratosphere. And Charlotte reveals to Delia that she's had a secret child. The father of that child happens to be Clem Spender, who is the long lost, or not long lost, but lost love of Delia, who she moved on from him unconsummated to marry a solid Ralston and do everything right. And together they conspire to raise baby Tina, the secret baby, in New York society, always a little adjacent to it, without anyone knowing who her parents are. And as you point out in the introduction, it's both aligns with a lot of Wharton's themes that she returned to over and over again, certainly time and place, and a lot of the characters in the novella are repeated. A lot of them are in Age of Innocence. The names are very familiar. If you've read Age of Innocence, like everybody's first and last name is this circular pool of signifying relation to each other. It's also like a little risque, as you point out, because of the very basic premise of the plot. So how do you see this functioning in like the context of the Wharton multiverse or universe as you paint it in the introduction?
Yeah, so Old New York was published, this collection of 4 novellas, of which The Old Maid is one. It was published after the Age of Innocence, and it kind of crossed over the same terrain at in different decades. So The Old Maid is that about 25 years before the Age of Innocence, but among the same society, basically. And she wrote all of these novels, Age of Innocence and these, not The House of Mirth, while she lived in France. So she was really conjuring up this world of her own childhood from a distance, and with a kind of obsessive fervor and returning into it again and again. Edith Wharton was born Edith Jones in a family whose name literally gave rise to the expression keeping up with the Joneses. They were really well off, and she summered in Newport, was raised with governesses, and so on. So she had kind of vivid memories of this very privileged, but also really cosseted, really kind of restricted world. She herself was not allowed to read novels because they were not considered appropriate for young women to read. So it really shows kind of anti-intellectual streak among this group. And I think Old New York, to me, above all, what it shows is the supreme achievement of the Age of Innocence in a stylistic way, because because Edith Wharton was so prolific, she wasn't always it's not like every novel she wrote was absolutely amazing, but The Age of Innocence is, and it's because she shows so much restraint in the characterization, in the dialogue, and it has a little bit less of a satirical eye than her first big novel, which was The House of Mirth. And honestly, page for page, there's not a spare word in The Age of Innocence. And the situation itself is a little bit more finely turned and you know, it's not just that the protagonist's love affair is not consummated, but they aren't even able to speak their feelings for the majority of the book. So it's really in a muted key, kind of covered over by this warm nostalgia and very gentle satire of this lost world. The stories in Old New York, in contrast, are a lot more lurid. The Old Maid is, of course, about an illegitimate child and a somewhat tropey concept of a foundling baby. But another story, New Year's Day, is about a woman who has to prostitute herself to cover her husband's medical expenses. And really, none of these are what you might expect from just reading The Age of Innocence. But it just shows that Wharton really tried to attack this world from many different angles. And I think together they really form a fascinating portrait of how much she tried to process this world that she herself fled. So at turns, it was kind of this rose tinted lost world that ended with the Great War, which is what we get from The Age of Innocence. At times, it's a bit more of this society that's almost as archaic as ancient Rome, or a place where you would find relics from. And she underscores that a bit in The Old Maid, which goes on a bit about taboos and bygone customs and rights that they had, that is clear even from the point of view of her writing are completely obsolete now. But I think she had a similar impulse to a lot of 19th century novelists like Balzac, to return to this world again and again and build out this big cast of characters. And it's really wonderful to dive into an author like that. It's really like, dipping into an ocean to realize there's so much there. And we rarely see it that much in literary fiction now, that writers are so prolific in this way. So I think as a Wharton completist, it's great to read The Old Maid after The Age of Innocence, although it's a completely different beast.
I agree. It's like seeing the character of like Sillerton Jackson, who in The Age of Innocence is kind of this observer, like active observer, because he's collecting information, and he shows up in pivotal points, and he shows up in a pivotal point here too, sort of not quite as noticeable and only once, but it's like this idea of having these repeating characters reflect things about the characters that the story is focused on in these very useful and economical ways. It's great. In the latest Penguin edition of The Age of Innocence, in the introduction by Sarah Blackwood, she states that she thinks that The Age of Innocence has a happy ending, which she says most people would disagree with. And I feel like in your introduction, you're kind of making a similar argument about The Old Maid, where like the society's rules and norms, as critical as Wharton can be of them, also the fact that people can read them and understand them, even though they're never acknowledged verbally, allows the characters to kind of move around obstacles and get what they want, or like a parallel universe, imperfect version of what they want by the end. And you talk about Wharton's, quote, qualified appreciation of certain lost values and something worth preserving throughout, like you just kind of touched on. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think The Old Maid has a happy ending? Or do you think it's a happy story?
It's certainly not a tragic ending, both for The Old Maid and The Age of Innocence. And I don't know if Wharton would use the phrase happy ending, but I think it's not helpful to think of a comic ending, because traditionally in the Western tradition, the end of a comedy is about wholeness and reintegration of a society that is sort of disrupted or on the brink of disorder based on the actions of the plot. And traditionally, I think a tragedy not just ends in death, but that disintegration deepens. Whereas in both The Age of Innocence and The Old Maid, the society is somewhat able to absorb the actions of the plot and come back together as a unified whole. So in that tradition, I think it's a comic ending. And I also think that Wharton has a very mature take on both happiness and on love and romance. So I think that the character of Delia herself goes through this progression where she is kind of a naive and an innocent. And then when she learns about these kind of indiscretions of her cousin, one of her biggest relations is, I didn't know anything about what life is really like. I didn't even know how affairs worked. And she really feels it's passed her by because she's never had this grand passion that her cousin did. But then by the end, I think she actually comes to a more mature appreciation of the fact that her life is not simply about having, or everyone's life is not simply just about having a passionate romance. There's a lot more that goes into a life, and romantic love is one part of it, but certainly not the only part. And for her part, obviously she had a happy marriage, and although her husband died, she raised several children to adulthood. So I think for a Wharton character, happiness is in some ways an end to striving. So at the end of the Age of Innocence, I do think, and it's really underscored in the finale, Newland Archer makes peace with his decision, and so much so that he doesn't need to see the Countess again. And it's a really poignant scene, but we must imagine, I think, like the text you referenced, that Countess Lanska found her own kind of happiness after that. And I don't think she and Newland were a great match anyway. He was doing Olympic level projection of his desire to break free of his what he felt was his society's strictures. So he has stopped striving by the end. May Welland certainly has gotten what she wanted. And I think both Charlotte and Delia in The Old Maid have stopped wanting to move mountains. Delia and together they've pulled off the best thing for their daughter, which they both consider their daughter, which is ushering her into society and into a secure marriage. So they're no longer, Charlotte doesn't care about acceptance anyway. That's why she made these choices. So she's no longer concerned about anything. And Delia, I think, has also come to peace with her way of carrying things off. And I would contrast that to something like The Custom of the Country, where one reason the ending is so strident and kind of abrupt is because you realize Undine Spragg is never going to stop striving. She's had her most successful marriage yet after conquering old New York and a French count and now an American billionaire. But the very last few lines of the novel are about how she realizes that a divorcee can't become an ambassador's wife. So this kind of endless cycle of desire is the essence of a tragic Wharton character to me. And it's kind of the same thing with Lily Bart, where she never, although she keeps slipping further and further down her social station, she never stops kind of delusionally hoping that something might turn her luck around. And that's part of why her end is so tragic. Whereas I think Charlotte and Delia have really made peace with their social station and the way things have turned out. So I would say in the kind of mature and socially conscious and not totally individualistic way that Edith Wharton tends to conceptualize a good life, it is a happy ending.
Yeah, there's a quote from near the end that I'll read that's talking about Delia, and says, "The older woman whose whole life had been shaped and colored by the faint reflection of a rejected happiness hung dazzled in the light of bliss accepted," talking about Tina's marriage and how like Tina was like, I feel like both Charlotte and Delia totally project onto Tina in ways that change throughout the novella. It's a short novella really, but it's a lot happens in a closed space, and they both like just project onto Tina their versions of their own identity and like an evaluation of their own choices. And it feels like at the end they both see some catharsis in her marriage or some realization of something that they assign to themselves in a way that's really interesting and I think a little suspect. And I think Wharton leaves open the question of like whether things are always so tidy, but also like put some value in just the social. She uses at one point the phrase "the smooth social surface," and like keeping that smoothness being beneficial to everybody. It's I'm a little suspicious of it all the time, but also that might just be me. What do you like? How would you ultimately characterize Delia and Charlotte's relationship to each other? Like, is that even something that can be defined or summed up, or does it come to any kind of conclusion to you?
Yeah, I would call them allies. A lot of their, they were close as cousins, and then Delia had to take the upper hand and kind of force an ultimatum on her to deal with the scandal, which was, figuring out a way for her baby to be raised by her. But she did kind of impose an ultimatum on her, which was, it's either the baby or your Ralston husband. You can't have both. So obviously they're not on equal footing because Delia, both by age and her station in life, which is that she became a married woman first, had a lot more power than Charlotte to make this happen. But also, Charlotte had something that Delia really wanted and was really jealous of, and the amount of text that's devoted to almost in humiliating detail, showing just how little Delia knew about adult life and passion and things like that, shows that Charlotte does have something on her. So they're not totally a relationship of, the powerful and the subjugated. And they strategically come together to take care of their daughter. Together, I think they form one mother to her. The Clementina never learns who her biological mom is in the text. So as far as she's concerned, one has been her guardian and the other has been kind of her social protector. And we know that one is her biological mother and one is her now adopted mother. So together they do form one complete whole. And when we get the scenes of their arguments, which are pretty fierce, and again, much more explicit than anything we see characters doing in The Age of Innocence or even in The House of Mirth, they duke it out often in the same kind of chintzy rooms that Wharton loves to make fun of. And they face each other with weapons spent, is what she says at one point. So it really has a lot of military and fighting imagery associated with their arguments, but they ultimately can't let each other go. So I think they would call them strategic allies. I wouldn't call them friends, but they are family. And I think in this world, one thing that Wharton values is the kind of bonds of family and tribe that supersede kind of individual likes and dislikes, which I think is something she saw was slipping even as she became an adult. And that really changed after the Gilded Age, which created this whole new class of sort of tycoons and just the kind of rapacious individuals who became wealthy in the new New York. So I think she implicitly throughout has an appreciation for these kind of basic family values, which she thinks are a relic of this age.
Yeah, they say so much more directly to each other than as the novel goes on. Then I feel like definitely more than you see in The Age of Innocence, which is so much about what people aren't saying, but also in other books, there's lots of maneuvering and manipulation, but there are these moments of extreme honesty, and the image of Charlotte kissing Delia's hand intensely after their second huge emotional argument / power play, shifting power play between them is really touching. I think it's not simple. It's not like a simple gesture of love, but it's feels very real. And there's a movie version, which is based on a play, which was written in 1935 by Zoë Akins, and she won the Pulitzer Prize for drama for it. And in the play, which you can hear, I'll send it around in the email, you can hear an audio version of at the Internet Archive, and in the movie, they copy word for word some of that dialogue of their big fights, which I'm glad, because the movie has Bette Davis, which is great, but there's a lot lost in translation. Isn't that surprising? But I think keeping those words that they say to each other is really great. So in the interest of time, we'll zoom out a little bit, although feel free to keep talking about this book. But I wanted to ask, as a big Wharton fan, who's your favorite Wharton character of any book total?
Well, it's hard to pick one, but one of my favorite characters is May Welland from The Age of Innocence, which I think is a um, left field pick at best, because she's often considered to be the villain of that book. But I think the villain of that book is Newland Archer, who's terminally indecisive, and the subject of some of the best situational jokes in the novel. But I really respect May, and came to love her as a character for a scene in The Age of Innocence in Florida, when she takes Archer aside, and she doesn't know about her cousin per se, but has known that he's dated women in the past and had affairs, and says, if you want to go back to the affair, you should do it. There's no compulsion to marry me. And she's so young and so inexperienced of life, but just so powerful in that moment, where she doesn't compel Archer to do anything, much as he would like to believe himself a victim. And I think it takes a huge strength of character to allow him to walk away. She's not desperate for his affections, and she's no fool. And I think her way of carrying things off is in some ways similar to Delia's, where she just does things without explaining them or creating huge drama. She just sees to it that things work out. I think her discretion and her really quiet strength of will make her one of the best underappreciated Wharton characters, and one about whom even Edith Wharton, who is not like exactly in the Jane Austen level, but really gets in digs at a lot of characters for how dumb or tacky they are, can't really find it in herself to diss her. So I think I'm team May.
I'm team May too. And everyone, please put, if you have favorite Wharton characters or Wharton villains, put those in the chat too. But I agree that I think Archer's the villain of that book. I think he's a soft boy. People like he's constantly using his own insecurity or projecting his own insecurities on other people and his own indecisiveness on other people. And I think May's a lot more complicated. And I also see parallels between her and Delia. I think we get so much more in Delia's head. So we see the conflicting motivations there, where sometimes she's doing something for herself and can't admit it to herself. And sometimes she's truly just confused. And sometimes she's got these pure motivations, I think, but it's all kind of mixed together, which it feels kind of good to see inside a character that on the surface could just look like this placid, obedient creature of a society that doesn't give a lot of flexibility to women.
Yeah, and of course the common ancestor of Delia and May, which is revealed in this book, is Mrs. Mingot, who's a very entertaining, hugely obese grande dame in The Age of Innocence. Here is kind of an eccentric aunt who lives in Paris, but in both cases she is the precedent for someone who manages to grandfather in all these unconventional arrangements into their seemingly strict society. So I think it's no coincidence that these two characters share that way of pulling things off.
She invented the, like, if you act like it's normal, everyone else will too, of their compact little society. Wharton loves reinforcing how small and tight this world is. I think throughout all of her high society New York books, which I think are all having a big pop culture moment. Some of them more acknowledged than not. Have you seen the HBO show, The Gilded Age, or did you follow the Met Gala, the Gilded Glamour Met Gala?
Yes to both. I'm glad it's having a moment. I think anything that gets Americans interested in history is net good, because we tend to be hugely presentist as a culture. I think obviously a lot of things get sanded off in these mainstream cultural products. And I think the biggest risk is seeing just the shiny surface of the Gilded Age, which in Wharton, it's very clear that it's not just a glamorous world. And she does a great job of this in the intro to The Old Maid, where she in just a few strokes sets up how close these people were to the to the American founding fathers. They served Washington, they admired Hamilton. So they were really part of this new society. And I think the extent to which they were making things up comes across in Edith Wharton, who lived through it and returned to it again and again, and maybe does not quite come across that way in some of the mainstream cultural products. But something that the Gilded Age show does well is show the kind of capital that fueled the Gilded Age. So I think that's definitely worth getting into the public sphere. Obviously, the Gilded Age was a time of great inequality, and it's the time when America went from being a farm country to an industrialized country. So in 1850, about 2/3 of all Americans were farmers, and then by 1900, only about a quarter were. So all of these changes were happening in America at that time, and I think it's important to appreciate them. I think something else that comes across when you see kind of diluted or like just whatever new representations of this era is just how good Edith Wharton's plots are, and it's not by accident. As Hermione Lee has shown in her great biography, Edith Wharton spent a huge amount of time with plotting out all of her novels and turning the screw tighter each time, so that there was always a kind of suspenseful note to hang on, and that they read inevitably, in her words, from beginning to end. And you really get a respect for how she did that in the text medium in this age of like infinitely long shows and movies. She was really a working writer. She wanted to entertain and keep her readers paying attention. And I think, it's more impressive now than ever before, how good she was at her craft.
Yeah, I think like everything's so dense, like they're readable, but there's so much there. And like you said about Age of Innocence, like everything's there doing something for your understanding of the characters and also the world they live in. And if you think about like the show, they're focused on this like rich upper class society, and they're trying to highlight some of the rapid changes like electricity or something, but it feels sometimes, I'm glad the show exists, but I felt sometimes like they were just kind of like checking off boxes of like, we looked at this, whereas I think Wharton just weaves things in, and partly she was looking back on her own life. So she was writing this after she lived it, but she was, the characters who aren't part of the upper class society seem very intentionally and carefully placed to highlight certain things about the characters and also about the very specific weird world they live in and how it feels so normal to them. But I think reading it, especially in 2022, you just think like, what? Like you're just casually leaving orphans with like the handyman's family and no one's blinking, yet it's totally weird. It's totally weird for a rich woman to start like caring for orphans on the side with all of her resources and so on. She just does a lot. And I'm glad people are reading her again. I saw a tweet that said, why didn't they call the Gilded Age all about Spragg, referencing Undine Spragg in
I think there is meant to be a Custom of the Country TV show at some point. So maybe that's why.
Well, I'll definitely watch that. Just one more question, then we'll open it up for more, although feel free to add anything else you want to say. Is you coined the phrase hot Wharton fall last year, and it was in the New Yorker review of a recent republishing of her Ghosts collection, and it was on Twitter. People were talking about hot Wharton fall, reading Edith Wharton in the fall. What does a Wharton spring and summer look like?
Well, the biggest part of that one, which obviously I have no idea why it resonated, but I guess a lot of people did want to read Edith Wharton then and now. And I was certainly reading it intensively with a lot of my friends, which is a great experience. She's a social novelist who I encourage people to read socially, and it's really fun to discuss her just so many aspects of her craft with friends. Well, Edith Wharton, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention she's written a novel called Summer, which is a bit of a downer. It's set in New England, so it's more in the Ethan Frome realm, and it's one of her most erotically explicit novels. So I don't think it's like top shelf Edith Wharton, but it's kind of like it expresses an id that you could see coming out of Wharton when she moved to France and was able to toss off some of the fetters of her upbringing. And after she had a kind of life-altering affair with a journalist named Morton Fullerton, you start to see her being more confident about writing things like sex scenes, which is honestly kind of shocking to read even in this stage. So you could read Summer if you want. I wouldn't run to it. Maybe after you've read all the top five. But I think spring and summer to me are the seasons of coming together, and with that comes inevitable dramas and conflicts. And Edith Wharton is the great novelist of looking at a drama and conflict from every direction. So whatever you find yourself getting into in the coming warmer months, I think Edith Wharton could be a guide or a balm or an indication of what not to do.
We remain in an age of contradiction and hypocrisy and different rule books for different people and settings. So kind of evergreen, I think. Does anyone have questions for Krithika or about the book or Wharton in general, or about Cita Press? Feel free to put them in the chat or say them out loud, unmute and say them out loud. While you're thinking about it, Krithika, is there anything else you want to leave us with thinking about this book or?
Yeah, I mean, one theme that I didn't expect to find that I loved in The Old Maid was this deep undercurrent of two American streams of religion, which was the Puritans who settled America and the kind of WASPs who came to dominate old New York. And this is not really present in most of her other novels, but she really draws it out well here, drawing out this contrast between the religious fervor of the earliest Americans. We're not that far removed from these characters, and this kind of softened church that they nominally go to in their society, which is very much subordinated to the merchant class and banking and so on. And I think thinking about that really helps you understand the kind of character that Charlotte is, because she's kind of an atypical Wharton character. She's actually a little bit static, I would say, because she's so single-minded in her motivation to protect her child and so immune from like social censure and things like that. But I think it makes sense if you think of her as the essence of this Puritan stream that ran through early Americans. And to me, that she really shows the influence of Nathaniel Hawthorne, because her character and what she does in this book seems so Hawthornian, between her kind of steely resolve. The plot itself is not unlike the Scarlet Letter, but also the kind of allegorical nature of her banishment and returning to the fold. And I think it's really interesting how Wharton read her predecessors, but also goes to show that she had not that many predecessors in America at the time. So she was really helping shape what American fiction could be. And that's partly why her influence continues to be felt today and casts such a shadow over the social novel in the American context. But, you know, as someone who really enjoys thinking about religion and faith, this was a really interesting thread of this novella that I think really elevates it beyond the rest of this collection.
Absolutely. And the introduction goes into that in really fascinating and thoughtful and surprising ways that changed the way I reread the book. So we have a question in the chat. Could you speak to how you situate Wharton in your journalistic work, and how you see her work playing in your analysis of current events?
I I don't think one bears on the other, to be totally honest, but she was, Wharton herself was a journalist at times. She wrote a lot of just from wartime France, was really active in the war effort, and wrote a lot of books of collected what we might call today a reportage. So I don't think she was great at it though. So I think these are really two different arts. Her art was truly in fiction. No one could match her, but I think her travelogues are not really. They don't have that much in common with her fiction, I would say, although she had a wonderful connoisseur's eye for art and landscapes and things like that. I refer to Edith Wharton much more now as a historian and I'm really inspired, especially by her process that is detailed by Hermione Lee in her great biography of the way she structured her plots. And it's not an accident that Wharton's novels are so readable. And that's made me really think about pacing, especially in telling history. The challenge is to make things readable, but not seem inevitable, which is like from reading anything from the present day, a lot of things will seem inevitable. So that's the central challenge of a historian. So to create that narrative drive, I think I've been studying Wharton for that reason. And also as someone who economically can convey a lot of information about the upper classes, about their dress, and really milk a single detail like the fabric of someone's dress, the stationery they use for all it's worth. It's really made me think a lot about how I work with 19th century sources and to be really judicious, because the reason her best novels are so good is because of their restraint and how much she's cut out from them as every draft goes on. So I really think I work with her. I use her work a lot as a historian, not very much as a journalist.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your next book. I think there's an NYRB article. It's related, right? I mean, it's on one of the sisters, and it's a great, compelling read. So as I mentioned, I'll share links that we talked about, and also some related links to Wharton projects that people might be interested in. Like there's a project to digitize her entire library at the Mount, which was her estate. So it's taking images of the covers of all the books that she collected in her personal library and organizing them, so you can kind of look through like what her book collection was, and it's some surprising stuff. So I'll send links to everyone to all of that stuff. Yeah, any final questions before we wrap up, or comments from anyone like that? Okay, well, you can follow Cita on Instagram and Twitter, and you can also just go to our website, which is in the chat. And we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to via our website. We do not send very many emails, like not even every month. So it's not going to fill up anyone's inbox. Krithika, is there anything you'd like to leave us with other than your website that's in the chat?
No, that's all. As Jessi mentioned, I'm an editor at The Drift. Would love if you guys checked it out. Our next issue, we're working to close it right now, and it'll be out very soon. So nothing to plug beyond that. My book, I think, will take a couple of years. So thank you all for tuning in. It was so great to talk to all of you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thanks for all the thanks in the chat. And yeah, I hope everyone has a good rest of your night, however many hours that involves.